Hi guys, and welcome to our next lesson on famine. Today we're going to be looking at cruelty and then the relief efforts during the famine. Now this is quite a broad topic, so there's going to be more than one lesson on these two issues. So today we're looking at some of the features, and tomorrow in the next lesson we'll be looking at some more of the relief efforts and the cruelties that went on during the Great Hunger. So to start off with, I want you to just have a bit of a think about this picture in front of you. So I want you to tell me what is happening in this picture, do you think? And look for the details. So can you pick out three specific details from this picture to make you think this is what's going on? So I'm going to suggest you pause here for about a minute or 2 minutes and have a think about this image. Okay, so in this image, some of the features you may have picked out. You may have seen this couple in the middle who seem to be begging this man on the horse, man with the top hat. Obviously, the top hat here kind of stands out because it looks to be in very good condition. The man himself is on a horse. He seems to be wealthy, so he is most likely a landlord or possibly the agent of a landlord. And the poor people begging him seem quite desperate and destitute, are clearly struggling, people who are struggling. You can see around the sides of the picture people with official looking helmets on, so police or army men. You can see the rifle being held with the bayonet on top. So people, this is clearly something official going on. This is nothing illegal, even though these people do seem to be quite desperate. Anyway, you can see a man there pulling what looks like the straw or probably the thatch from the roof, and you can see people on top of the roof pulling the thatch off. What's happening here is an eviction. Okay, now evictions were horrible, horrible things, and as we've seen in the documentary we looked at before Christmas, they were a part of life that some the people, locals, would have to enforce. So local townspeople would be evicting their neighbours as part of their work, and it's a very, very difficult thing to have to do for those people, and of course it leaves the people who are evicted in a very desperate situation. So well done if you figured out, if you noticed any of those particular features. You may have also noticed a man holding a club in the background, driving the animals. You can notice the destitution with the bare trees around the place. You may notice the amount of people here. It seems to be quite a large affair, and a number of other things you may have noticed as well. Well done if you got some of those main features. Today's lesson, what we want to do is we want to be aware of some of the cruelty enacted against the cottiers during the famine. We want to understand the political ideas of the time and how these affected the government response to the famine. And we want to begin to examine some of the relief measures offered to the people of Ireland. So during today's lesson, this is the main task for you, is to answer these questions. And I'm looking for a short paragraph to answer each question. So the first question is, what examples of extreme cruelty do we know of from the famine? The second question, explain laissez-faire economics in your own words. So we'll be going through that. And the third question, what were the public works and what were the positives and the negatives of this public works scheme? So quite a lot to go through today, so it's going to be quite a lot of me talking and explaining different features. All of this is also in the booklet, so please use that booklet to support your learning and the work that we're doing here today. So I'm just going to get going. Please feel free to pause whenever you need to in order to answer those questions. I'll pop the questions back up on the screen at the end again, but I would suggest maybe it's a good idea to pause here and write down the questions so you know what you're listening out for as the video goes along. So, the famine, as we all know, was a very, very difficult time in Irish history. There was an extreme blight, the potato crop, which we've talked about, was affected very, very severely, and people simply did not have enough food. Now, there are arguments have been made by historians that what actually happened was a genocide, that this was a systematic attempt to exterminate an entire group of people. Now, there's different arguments for both sides. Most historians say it's not really a genocide, but that there is definitely an example of a very lax government, a government not helping its people, a government that's very much abandoning and neglecting the people, and that is a huge cause of the starvation during the famine. So some of the cruelties that we can see during the famine is there's continued high rents. We know that the landlord class owned the vast majority of the land in Ireland. Now, rent was collected usually on a yearly or bi-yearly basis, and during the and even during the years of the famine, despite the fact that there are 7 years of extreme hunger, people are still expected to work to pay their rent. There is no uh, leeway given by the landlords. There's no sense of, okay, look at you're really struggling at the moment, we're not going to ask for too much rent. There's no sense of really of the landlord saying, here, have some time off. Now, that is a general statement. There are definitely examples of some landlords who did help out their tenants, who were very kind, very humane, and very helpful to the tenants, but they are in the minority. For the vast majority of cottiers, they're still expected to pay the high rents that they've been paying before the famine, despite the fact that they're starving. The fact that they are expected to pay these high rents is something that they are never going to be able to achieve. And because they are not able to pay the rent, we see a continuance of a lot of evictions and indeed a growth in the number of evictions during the famine. As people are unable to pay their rent, they are simply forced out of their houses. And now if you think back to that picture we looked at the start, we've seen people taking the thatch off the roof of the house. What was happening here is that when the landlord evicted the cottiers or the small tenant farmers from their land, the landlord needed to make sure that they would not be coming back, because the landlord's not going to sit in the house, he's not going to use their home, and he doesn't want them coming back when they're not paying rent. And so the houses tend to be destroyed, the roofs tend to be burned or taken away, so the house is left uninhabitable. So the evictions are not just people being told to leave, the evictions are very cruel and acts and very physical acts forcing these people out. While these evictions and starvation is happening, there is continued exportation of food from Ireland. Now, there is a number of different uh, sources. There's a number of different ways you can look at this. Yes, food is being exported from Ireland and it continues for a long time. But there is some relief in the early years of the famine where a lot of food is also being imported and sent into Ireland. Okay? But we can definitely say towards the later years of the famine that there's a huge problem with food mainly being exported and not nearly enough food coming into the country to help the people. So even though food is being grown in Ireland and there's possibly enough food at times to feed the entire population of Ireland, it is being exported, and the poor people, the cottiers and the landless labourers and the poorest members of Irish society simply cannot access this food that is in the country. And so a lot of people turn to emigration as their escape. And we will be looking at the emigration in a lot more detail later on. But one thing to be aware of here is that the emigration, while it is seen as a saving grace to be able to leave the country, it's incredibly expensive and families have to save up or use their entire life savings in order to pay for one member of the family to escape, to be sent over to America usually, or possibly the UK or Canada. When these people were sent off, they were then expected to spend the first few years away working and sending money back so that younger members of the family would also be able to emigrate at a later date, and they're expected to go and save their family. But when you were emigrating, while it was seen as a saving grace, it was a very difficult journey to make, and often huge amounts of people died aboard what became known as coffin ships, ships that were being sent off, not being properly equipped to actually support the transport of humans. And a lot of people suffered greatly aboard these ships. So the emigration was a very cruel prospect. It was while it was seen as the only way of surviving, it was not by any means something that people would in modern days see as a great saving grace to a starving people. And so you can see there's a lot of cruelty going on here. Even when people have some way of surviving, it's in very harsh conditions. Okay. Now it is important to note that there are landlords who are helping, there are landlords who are paying for their tenants to emigrate, there are landlords who are stopping rents, and there is a lot of charity going on in the country. And we'll see in tomorrow's lesson the charity of a particular group called the Quakers having a huge impact upon Irish society. But there's a lot of people of the landlord class and the government class and the people who have money who could have helped who simply refuse to. A lot of this comes down to a government policy at the time, which is called laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire, and this term has entered the common usage in the language, and basically what it means is not to get involved. And so, under laissez-faire economics, the government believes that they should not be overly involved in the economic world of the people, that the economy will sort itself out. If you leave things to themselves, they eventually fix themselves, and this is due to market forces. Now, I am not an expert in economics, so your business or economics teacher will be much better situated to really explain this in good detail. But essentially, they believe that but if government gets involved, it stops the market being able to fix itself. And so, in order for the world, if an economic recession happens, it means that something is wrong with the economy, and the economy needs to figure out how to fix itself. There is no such thing usually in laissez-faire economics as free healthcare. This is left to a market, so you pay for your healthcare. There is very, very little government involvement in helping the people who are struggling, and there is very little tax. The big problems with this is there's huge inequalities. When the market fails, it is very much going to fail dramatically, and this is what happens during the famine. And you can see monopolies where single groups or single classes take complete control. And these are all problems that we see in Ireland. The government simply doesn't see that as its job to help these people. It believes the people need to help themselves. And this links in then to the fact that they just don't have a real understanding of the level of poverty and destitution in Ireland at the time. Vast majority of the government would not have even visited Ireland and would not be aware of the desperate levels of poverty that were going on and the complete inability of the people who were starving to be able to help themselves. They simply believed that people should be working to help themselves, to save themselves. Okay? So this is what the people believe at the time. Now, regardless, there are some relief efforts that are put into place. The first of these, quite quickly, is something that happens in 1845, where the Prime Minister organises for huge shipments of maize or corn to be sent to Ireland to feed the people. So there's enough maize actually sent into the country in 1845 to feed 1 million people. Now, this could have been a huge saving effort, and indeed did save a lot of people. The problem was that demand was very high, and the food was being sold at cost price, which means the government didn't profit off this. However, they weren't giving it away for free, and they weren't losing any money on this. They were still asking the people to pay for it. And for the poorest people in Irish society, they simply just don't have the money to pay for it. They lived off the food they grew. When the food didn't grow, they didn't have a backup of money to be paying for expensive corn that was coming in, no matter how much the government wanted it to be sold cheaply. So whilst this was a fair, an attempt to help the people, it showed a lack of understanding of the extreme poverty these people were living in, and it didn't have the effect that it could have had this maize being given away at a cheaper or price or for free. So that was the first attempt that was sent to try to help the people of Ireland who are starving. The government then introduces a system called the Public Works Scheme, and this is led by a man named Charles Trevelyan. Some of you may be familiar with this name from the song The Fields of Athenry. They are talking about this same man. We may look at that song at a later date. Under the Public Works Scheme, essentially what this was offering work to the poor and destitute people. And it was the government saying, look, we know you're starving, but we're not going to give you anything for free. You need to work in order to earn enough money to pay for food to survive. This may seem like a fairly fair system. However, the work that these people were asked to do was back-breaking work and has been described by certain stories as slow murder. The work they are asked to do is things like building roads, extremely difficult work. extremely hard work. And it is made extremely hard by design, because the idea is that if you give people really, really hard work, they'll want to go back and work in their fields. And it shows a lack of understanding again of the fact these people are not being lazy. These people simply can't work, can't do their work, because the food they're working to grow just isn't growing. So there's a huge, again, lack of understanding here. It also shows that people don't understand or the government is not really empathizing with the starvation of the people, because it's expecting people in the worst moments of their lives in extreme starvation to do incredibly difficult work. So the work is offered, and a lot of people do take it up, but it's incredibly difficult and slow torture and considered slow murder by some people. The payments in return for this work is very, very minimal. Okay, and indeed, as the work goes on, the payments actually get cut even further. So that even though these people are going out and working extremely long days, doing back-breaking work, they aren't even getting enough money to feed their family. So there's huge, huge problems with the public works. There is evidence, however, of these works still around the country, and the picture here on the screen is a Famine Road built by the public works. It's one of the more famous Famine Roads. I believe this one is in Kerry, and it shows that oftentimes, while some of the roads that were built were actually very useful roads and roads that were needed, a lot of the time the roads and things and different things that were built and bridges and stuff that were built were not useful at all. They were simply being built in order to make people work. They were provided simply as an opportunity for work, and the roads some have gone into disuse, they simply weren't needed, and you can still see evidence of these roads around the country. So the public works, while it was a relief effort, was an extremely harsh way of offering relief. People were really struggling, were forced to do the hardest work imaginable for very little pay, and many, many died on the roadside while trying to do this work. They simply just dropped dead. So you can see that while some relief efforts are being offered by the government, there is a real lack of understanding from the government of what's going on in Ireland. Right. Now, as things go on, there are a few more relief efforts offered, and we'll be discussing them in tomorrow's lesson. So we'll be looking at, or in our next lessons, we'll be looking at the Quakers, and we'll be looking at the workhouses and things like that. But for today, I think that's quite enough for today. So back to those 3 questions. So a short paragraph on each. What examples of extreme cruelty do we know of from the famine? Explain laissez-faire economics in your own words. And what were the public works, and what were the positives and negatives of this scheme? Okay, guys, any questions, just drop me an email. Thanks for listening.